So what we're going to talk today about is the 25 years of some of the lead housing and human settlements programs in South Africa. Okay, that's what we're going to be talking about. And what I'm going to do, oops, there we go, is trying to divide it up into different kinds of periods. So to give a periodization of the different policies, how they were thought about, what happened during each, how they've developed, and to give some sense of the evolution, okay, of these main programs over the last 25 years or so. So we'll look at the transition period, building foundation, breaking new ground, and then have a look at the kind of contemporary period itself. But before we get into that, I think it's very important to note something extremely fundamental to what we know about housing and human settlements policy in South Africa. And that is that it comes under the, domination, influence, impact of a number of different sectors. It's not just about policy, okay? And housing and human settlements policy, implementation, practice, all of these things are incredibly influenced by a number of different factors. Amongst them is history. I mean, there's no question of that. The way that our cities look, okay, and the fact that in many cases we haven't been able to change them, is a factor of our history. It's obdurate. It's hard to change. It's embedded, okay? The way that our institutions function, okay, in many ways, has got a historical component to it. And we need to think about that, particularly when we think about housing and human settlements and policy. The next thing is that there's no question that housing and human settlements is political. It's political in a whole heap of different ways. It's political with a big P in terms of party politics. It's political with a small p in terms of personal politics and all kinds of power relationships. It's political in the sense that we know that there's a very strong connection between the idea of votes and housing delivery and service delivery. We know that it's political because every single time we think about how different spheres of government may or may not be accredited, politics creeps in and this affects delivery. So politics is a big one when we start to think about it. I mean, South African, politics is big about everything, but in housing, human settlements particularly so. And then housing and human settlements has also been highly influenced by the judicial environment. We've seen many constitutional court cases around socioeconomic rights in South Africa. Many. But the vast majority, and I stand to be corrected, but something like out of the last 27 different cases on socioeconomic rights, somewhere in the region of 12 or 13 of them have been around housing and human settlements issues. It has dominated the jurisdictional and the litigated, I never can say that, okay, court landscape, effectively. And these decisions have been incredibly influential in not only what policy has looked like, but how it's been implemented and how it's been put into practice. So we can't think about what's been happening around housing and human settlement policy without thinking about what's been happening within the courts, and particularly within the constitutional courts. The last one, of course, is that housing doesn't exist in some kind of vacuum, some kind of ether. Housing and human settlements are part of an entire ecosystem, okay, of property, of land, of issues around land. They're part of a construction sector. And as such, they're influenced about all kinds of things. They're influenced by the land market. They're influenced by construction costs. They're influenced by the real estate agencies. They're influenced by all kinds of things. They're even influenced by what happens in Brexit, okay, and what happens when Trump opens his mouth. Because effectively, all of these things start to also influence our economy. Once our economy is influenced, it affects the number of people who are employed or unemployed. The number of people who are employed or unemployed affects the number of potential beneficiaries who need housing. So we start to see that housing and human settlements is not just something that sits completely on its own. It's influenced from a number of factors: history, politics, the judiciary, big economic forces, kind of local economic forces, all kinds of things that come into play which influence what's going on. And as I speak and I take us through some of the history in these main programs, you'll begin to see why these different factors become important and how their interplay has really affected and shaped some of the things that we've seen, some of the policies and programs that have come about. How does that sound? You guys with me so far? Okay, so what we'll do is make another deal. If there's anything I say which you're not quite sure about immediately, just stick your hand up for a point of clarification. Points of debate we'll do afterward in discussion, but just points of clarification. Just quickly stick your hands up in the meantime. Okay, great. So let's start. All right, well, let's go back. I'm going to ask a few questions. So who here has heard of something called the National Housing Forum, the Botshabelo Agreement? Yep, some nods. Okay, yeah, Liza, of course you've heard of it. You don't count. But you, so you don't, what is it? Okay, no problem. Anyone else heard about it? National Housing Forum, Botshabelo agreements? Okay. Basically, what happened was during the transition period, just before we entered into a democratic phase, what we did is we had a situation where everybody, government, the different parties, the ANC, Sanko, private business, the mining industry, everybody realized that the question of this thing is really weird. Everybody realized that the issue of housing and human settlements and title deeds and land ownership was absolutely primary in terms of going forward. So what they did is they set up a huge meeting, okay, in Botshabelo, just outside Mangaung, and sat down and had a conversation around what to do about housing, what to do about the housing policy going into the new South Africa. And there were a number of points of debate. Have I gone forward or backward? Oops, gone backward. Okay, there were questions, big questions. How do you house people who are unhoused? About 1.5 million people at the time. What is that going to look like? Should it be done by the private sector, by the public sector? What kind of standard? What kind of tenure? Are we talking about ownership? Are we talking about rental? Is it going to be site and service scheme? What is it going to look like? And how quickly can we do this? And who should we do it for? So these questions around who's going to be a beneficiary, what should the housing policy at its really fundamental basis start to look like with the questions for the National Housing Forum? And they had massive debates, from what I understand. And eventually it was decided that what should come out of that first part of housing policy in South Africa should be a progressive, incremental approach to housing. So that people should be given a starter home. This was the idea. The people should be given a starter home which they could own, full tenure, title deed, and incrementally build on over time. That was sitting at the bottom of it, okay? And that's really where much of this started. And that it needed to have potable water, adequate sanitary facilities, and a domestic energy supply. Great. This is where we started from. And this very much has informed, right back then, much of the policy going forward, certainly for a very long time. And that was taken forward very much in the R&D program, the Reconstruction and Development Program, which came about in about 1994. And this was the big economic and kind of political program of South Africa. And really what it was about growth through redistribution and thinking about how do we really change the economy and society of South Africa in many, many different ways. And it was focused on building the economy, democratizing the state and society, developing human resources, nation building. But also, okay, was about meeting the basic needs of people, jobs, land, housing, water, electricity, telecoms, all kinds of different things. And it's also the program that gave its name to most of the houses we see in South Africa. We talk about them as RDPs, don't we? I mean, and it came out of this program. The thinking, the logic of what kind of housing would be delivered originally came out of the National Housing Forum, Botshabelo Agreement, and then, okay, started to be inculcated and started to find its way into policy, and particularly into the RDP. And the RDP, which is a macroeconomic policy, started to say this is how we're going to generate the environment in which we're going to produce houses. And from there, and from coming out of the RDP program, we had, well, not coming out of the RDP at the same time. Sorry, I thought there was another slide. And about the same time, we also had the finalization of the South African Constitution. Okay, so the South African Constitution is really important, and it started to also entrench and embed the idea of rights, and particularly socioeconomic rights. So now, I know I gave you a quick sneak peek, but who can tell me, what does the Constitution say about housing and the right to housing? What does it say? It's because there's some important stuff around there. What does it say? Does it say that everybody has a right to a house? Is that what it says? Everyone has a right to a house. If you think that, put up your hand. Does everyone have a right to a house? Yeah, okay, you think that, great. Okay, person at the back. All right, do people think that you have a right to something else? Okay, what do you have a right to?
Basic services.
Basic services.
Electricity and water.
Sorry?
Electricity, water.
Electricity, but yes, what about the Constitution, the right to housing particularly? What does the Constitution say about that? It also says, okay, that it's a progressive realization. And Then, so we've got two positive formulations of the right. First one says everyone has the right to have access to adequate housing. Okay. The second one says the state must take reasonable legislative and other measures within its available resources to achieve the progressive realization of this right. Okay. So what does that mean? Does it mean that the state has to give everybody a house? Is that what it means? Yes, no, maybe. No. Well, if you can come up with the answer to that, you'd be cleverer than most people in this country. It's a huge point of controversy. Nobody's exactly sure. And it keeps going to the Constitutional Court. But the way that it's largely been interpreted is that what the state is responsible for doing is that over a period of time, it needs to think about and improve and progressively improve on the way that it can ensure that everybody has the right to some form of adequate accommodation. Whether that is state supplied, whether that's supplied by the private sector, whether that's rental accommodation, whether that is site and service, it doesn't say. It just says that the state needs to provide the environment in which this becomes possible. And it needs to do that on an incremental and progressive basis. It also says, very importantly, the last one. Okay, can I do that? Ooh, there we go. Okay. Says no one may be evicted from their home or have their home demolished without an order of court made after considering the relevant circumstances. No legislation may permit arbitrary evictions. Okay, very important. Given the history of South Africa and forced removals, given the fact that people were moved arbitrarily off their land, out of their property, without too much thought, the Constitution enshrined the fact that people could not just be moved off their land willy-nilly. There had to be a court order. And this point right here, this clause of the Constitution has basically been the point of conversation in the Constitutional Court for most of the time. This issue of evictions and what it means. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So, going back to my kind of long stretch of narrative, we have the RDP program, and about the same time, we have about the finalization of the South African Constitution and the right to housing. And coming out of both of these things, we get the first piece of housing policy in South Africa, the Housing White Paper. And the housing, do you guys know about how policy is developed? Green papers, white papers, bills, acts, you know that whole transition? No? Okay. So basically in South Africa, if you ever want to get a bill passed, what you do is you go through the same process. You get a green paper, you discuss it, you negotiate it, you think about it, you send it out for comment. It comes back, everyone agrees, you get a white paper. White paper, once again, gets finalized, everyone sends it out, comment, everyone's happy with it, it gets sent as a bill. Once it is passed, okay, by Parliament, correct me if I'm wrong, it becomes an act, it becomes law. All right. So what we start to see is our first kind of move toward policy in South Africa, housing policy, is the white paper. And the white paper takes its cue from the RDP, it takes its cue from the National Housing Forum, it takes its cue from the Constitution, and comes up with 7 principles. We need to stabilize the housing environment, we need to mobilize housing credit, we need to provide subsidy assistance. Interestingly, it says we need to support the people's housing process, okay, which is about self-build. Quite interesting, that. We need to rationalize institutional capacities, which is basically the question around how we take all the different kinds of government that was in place and put it into a more efficient and more effective form, not just having a number of different departments for black people, for white people, for Indian people, colored people. It was just having a Department of Human Settlements. Okay, so rationalizing. Facilitating the speedy release of land and coordinating government investment and development. So those were the 7 principles that really came out. And then, okay, what that also started to develop, okay, was this idea of a national housing subsidy scheme, very importantly. And the National Housing Subsidy Scheme, okay, which then came out, not only white paper, but eventually the Housing Act, was basically said it's a once-off capital subsidy, okay, once-off capital subsidy to provide households of earning less than 3,500 rand with a home. And originally, this is what most of the starter homes looked like. Okay, and it was a subsidy purely from government to the individual to build a house. And way back when, okay, when I first started working in housing, not only was it just a capital subsidy, but there was also the fact that people, beneficiaries, had to make their own contribution. Okay, and it was a 2,479. I'll never forget that figure. 2,479 rand had to be contributed by households, either in cash or in what was called sweat equity. Okay, so people had to contribute. That eventually fell away. Okay, but it was part of this original kind of idea of how housing was developed, of human settlements. Okay, so that was our kind of first basis that was going on during the transition period. First of all, we come up with the National Housing Forum, Bocciarello Agreement, the Constitution, the Housing White Paper, Housing Act, and this idea of the National Housing Subsidy Scheme, and that's really where it all begins. And then these things start to get some kind of momentum. And what we start to see is in the next period, between 1997 and 1999, we get a whole heap, okay, of different legislation. And that goes right on to about 2003. So we get the National Housing Act, we get the Ministerial Norms and Standards, we get the Prevention of Illegal Evictions and Unlawful Occupation of Land Act, we get the Rental Housing Act, we get the Housing Code, we get the Public Finance Management Act, we get the Financial Sectors Charter. Boom, 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 boom. All of a sudden, we started to get this plethora of legislation, which is either directly related to housing and human settlements, which is directly in connection with housing and human settlements, or related to it in some ways, again, its performance. And we get this huge number of things that goes on. And the prevention of, okay, let me just go with that. The National Housing Act is about housing delivery, how we actually implement and deliver houses. That's really what it's all about. The Prevention of Illegal Evictions and Unlawful Occupation of Land Act is related to that clause within the Constitution that says you may not be evicted, okay, without a court order. And what it does as a piece of legislation is it tells us very clearly how and in what ways and when people may be evicted and under what conditions. It has gone through, I can't tell you how many amendments since then, but this is where it began. Okay. Then we get the Rental Housing Act, which starts to formulate the relationship between landlords and tenants, and the Housing Code. Okay, so what's the Housing Code? What's the Housing Code? Who said construction? Okay, construction, let's give more than one word.
The standard required for erecting housing structures.
Okay, yes, kind of. Anyone else want to have a go? Anyone else? Housing Code? No. Okay. Basically, what the Housing Code literally did is it gave the idea, the definitions and the conditions of who can benefit under what program. Who can benefit under the National Housing Scheme, who the beneficiaries are, how much they can earn, what their eligibility criteria are, how the program's going to work, what the relationships between the sphere of government are. It really was the how-to manual of taking the National Housing Act and implementing it, making it into a reality. That's what it did way back then. Okay. And it was very important because it really did give us a guideline of what to do, of how to translate these big ideas that existed in legislation, that existed in the Constitution, and make them into realities in provinces, in towns and cities across South Africa. That was its intention. Whether it did that or not, we can talk about. Okay. And then, very importantly, the Financial Sector Charter. Anyone know anything about the Financial Sector Charter? Okay. Financial Sector Charter basically committed the big banks in South Africa to providing funding for low-income and gap housing people. We'll talk more about it later and how it's actually functioned. But these are some of the key things that were going on during this period. But now let's have a look. How did this all function? So, this is a graph supplied by the National Department of Human Settlements about the number of units completed, okay, from the period 1994 to 2016. And what you can see is that over that period between about 1996 to, let's just say 1999, what we start to see is a huge peak, okay, in the number of units delivered under these programs, under the National Housing Subsidies Scheme, under the Housing White Paper. We start to see lots and lots of units actually being put on the ground. Some of those incremental units put there, people are being supplied, and by about 2001, the target of achieving 1 million houses has been achieved, okay, year on year. And we are celebrated. UN Habitat tells us we've got the most fantastic program in the world. Our ministers are lauded and praised. Rose petals are strewn in front of their feet as they walk down the streets. All is wonderful in the world. And then we start to see a couple of things that go on. We start to see a review of the housing delivery process. And some of the issues start to come to the fore around not only the number of houses that are being delivered, but questions about them. And a lot of questions start to be raised by communities, by academics, by policy, by all kinds of different arenas. And the questions that come up fundamentally are questions of quality. Okay? are these units any good? What's their quality like? Are they falling apart? Are they not? Are they big enough? You have to remember at this point, units are still quite small. They don't have a lot of insulation. They don't have internal partitions. Okay. Quite basic units. We start to see that there are questions around location. Key question, where are these units being delivered? And the issue comes back, well, they're being delivered on the periphery, aren't they? This is where land is cheapest. This is where municipalities, and particularly private provinces, can get access, okay, to land. So we start to see questions around their location and whether they're actually embedding and reinforcing the apartheid geographies that we've seen. We start to see questions around the fact that they are monofunctional. They're just houses, 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 and more houses, and not much else. Okay? We start to see questions of few accesses to social amenities. And then, okay, you know the old complaint, I went somewhere, I hated the food, and there was so little of it. Okay? Here it's the same thing. Okay? Here we're producing so many houses, okay, but the quality is so terrible. So now it's slowing down and people are still complaining. So what we started to see was an enhancement to national policy, what was called breaking new ground. And breaking new ground said, okay, what we need to do is we need to deal with all of these issues. We need to deal with issues of location, quality, tenure. We need to think about how we reimagine the housing landscape, how we bring it all together. And so they decided to look at moving away from a question of delivering houses to delivering human settlements. Sustainable human settlements was the big slogan, okay? And what that meant was to think about the whole of the property market, the whole of the land market, the whole of the housing market. It was to think about different kinds of tenure, to think about different kinds of housing options. And what came out of it eventually was a blank slide. No, okay, it was to move away from there to move to those, okay? So that was what we had been delivering. Unit at the steep split, and in case anyone's interested, and Graham got the slide, which I always like, and you can see there's not much there, and the idea was to move from that to that, okay? That was the theory. Big dreams, very ambitious kind of idea. And the way that they said they were going to do it was through a number of different programs. And so the new housing code, which came out, the Breaking New Ground came out in 2004, the new housing code came out in 2009, as far as I recall, but never mind, 5 years later, it's all okay. Was to have 17 different programs about how we would achieve these sustainable human settlements, to move away from just building house upon house upon house, and to move toward thinking about integrated settlements, sustainable human settlements. And so we started to see a whole lot of different funds and programs, informal settlement upgrades, provision for social and economic amenities, ways to assist municipalities I should probably use this pointer, to develop housing chapters, integrated residential development programs that target urban developments in well-located areas. So we started to see a shift in the way that we're thinking about housing and housing delivery. Not just houses, but communities, sustainable human settlements. And the funding started to, in theory at least, come through with these ideas. So that was it. 2005, as part of the kind of ongoing breaking new ground and new transition, we started to see a social housing policy, the delivery of social rental housing units of people earning 3,500 rand to about 7,500 rand, subsidized through a capital subsidy by government, and you'll probably hear more about this, basically implemented through social housing institutions. To my mind, and I'll go on record as saying this, the biggest waste of money that we've managed to spend in South Africa so far. 30,000 units and somewhere in the region of about 6 billion rand. But never mind, I mean, we can talk about that. So hugely, but seen as a major kind of urban intervention, restructuring the urban environments, and came out of 2005. At the same time, what we started to see was a battle for the informal settlement. So although Breaking New Ground said we need to do in situ, okay, informal settlement upgrading, so actually upgrade informal settlements where people are sitting rather than relocate them to housing developments. What was actually happening was that Minister Sisulu was saying we need to eradicate informal settlements. Okay, and there's a whole provision around actually just relocating people. And a battle was going on. Eventually, that was resolved through an informal settlement upgrading program. Okay, but that took quite a long time. But this was all going on during the late kind of 2000s. Okay? And at the same time, what we started to see was slowdown economic growth and a slowdown in the number of units. And we started to go from this kind of house to a bigger house to a bigger house, okay, delivered by RDP. So we moved, okay, from going from small starter units, which were 25 square meters, to 30 square meters, to 40 square meters, to 45 square meters in some provinces. Okay. Then we moved to producing houses, RDP units, with the same budget, which were not only bigger, but then had rental units attached to them as well. Okay. So all of this was going on. So we're getting a slowdown in delivery, we're getting an increase in the size of units being delivered, all under the Human Settlements Development Grant. Okay. And, okay, then we start to see another shift. I'll go back for a while. So we start to see the slowdown, and suddenly there's once again another thinking about what do we do about this? All of the problems that we've been facing in our cities, all of the problems that we've been facing in our urban environments are not going away. The spatialities of the urban geography, of division, of segregation are still there, despite breaking new ground. We've got all these new programs, but they're not being developed. We've got informal settlement upgrading, which exists in policy, but isn't being practiced. So we start to see another shift, another transition in policy and in thinking that starts to go on. And from about 2009, we see a shift where we start to see a changing environment and greater alignment, okay, between planning and housing. So this issue of about silos and whatever else, the ways of trying to think about how we address these things, how we start to move past these issues. So the National Development says, the development plan comes out in 2011 and says we need active citizenry, we can't go about business as usual, and we need to reinforce the importance of space, and we need to think about how we bring planning and how we bring spatial issues and housing and human settlements issues closer together. And then, out of all that comes out in 2012, the Financial and Fiscal Commission comes out with an absolute, banger, I suppose is the word for it. It comes out with something that shocks the housing and policy community. And they say publicly, government needs to stop building houses. We haven't got the money. We're not getting our bang for our buck. All of the things that we wanted to achieve with housing and human settlements is not being achieved. Spatial geography is remaining. These houses are not assets. People cannot sell them. They cannot buy them. They cannot use them for any kind of collateral. They're saying we are investing more and more. We're getting less and less. This is not a good program. We need to reconsider. Okay, so this is going on. But instead of doing that, what we start to see is a plethora of even more legislation in a whole different kinds of directions, which is quite interesting as a response. So we see, from human settlements, a recommitment by the minister to the housing program after the statement, but we also see a commitment to other things, to the gap market, to the FLIS product. And I won't go through all of this, I haven't got time. We start to see that SPLUMA, the Spatial Planning Land Use Management, comes out in 2013. Okay, and says within spatial development frameworks, we need to consider housing, okay, and where it's located. It needs to become part of our spatial development framework. We see the BEPS, the Built Environment Performance Plans, okay, which are managed by the City Support Program in Treasury. Okay, and they start to consider how you manage the Urban Settlement Development Grant. And once again, bringing together spatial change and transition with housing and starting to think through these things. We start to see the IUDF, which was mentioned, was drafted and is currently being redrafted, from what I understand, as a review of the IDPs. Okay, so we start to see this whole transition that's going on in the post kind of 2009 period. And we start to see changes in approach happen on the landscapes in our cities. One of the fundamental ones is we start to see a move toward mixed income, mixed use developments. Okay, they start quite early in the 2000s, but they really start to emerge on the landscapes of various cities in this kind of late 2011 to about 2014 period. And what we start to see is that it's a mixture between RDP units, social housing, gap housing, and you can't see, but on the edges you've got ordinary kind of market-related housing. So it's rental, it's RDP, you've got vertical RDPs, you've got all kinds of things in the settlement. This is Vloerhof, if anyone's interested. And that starts to become a very important factor in this period. We start to see the emergence of the idea of mega projects, my second least favorite thing on the landscape at the moment. The idea that what the provinces and the country is going to do are build huge new towns, 60,000 people strong, somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 units, built somewhere out there. Okay. Mixed income, they'll be self-sustaining. And my favorite is they'll have yachts, clearly, floating on the rivers, which infest South Africa. Anyway, so as you can tell, not happy about this. So this is one of the latest thinking that's come out at the moment. Okay. This is just a map also to show where the idea of the original location was and also where there are businesses. So you can see that the original locations were quite disparately located to where the actual businesses are, so we can talk. And then what we're starting to see are new and different kinds of current developments that are going on within the current environment. Once again, linking together planning and housing. So we're starting to see inclusionary housing. Came out of the Splooma originally, but it's now being taken up by, I think, 3 different metros at the moment. Cape Town, Joburg, and eThekwini are all thinking about inclusionary housing, which is, of course, the idea of how you include low-income beneficiaries into private sector housing developments as a percentage, 10%, 20%, or whatever else of units that might come into it, and that's becoming a very much part of the conversation. It's also become a conversation as part of the transit-oriented developments and the BRTs that are going into a lot of different places. So there's this connection that's going on once again. We're starting to see that the idea of site and service schemes is back on the agenda. After years of being absolutely persona non grata, it's now back and people are thinking about it.
Can you explain what site and services mean?
No, but yes, okay. Site and services, basically, one is provided with a piece of land, and what you have on it are basic connections to water and electricity, and one builds one's own home over a period of time, okay? So it's an incremental process of improvement with full ownership of that particular piece of land. Is that right, Liza? Okay, great. Okay. Then what we're starting to also see at the moment are conversations around land expropriation. Back on the agenda in a big way. Big political questions around it right now. And for the first time, it's not a rural conversation. We're beginning to see it as an urban conversation, thanks to colleagues who've been putting it on the urban agenda. And it's a question around, do we expropriate land within urban areas to change the spatial geographies, to give people assets, to make sure that the ideas that we've had start to come to fruition. And then, lastly, something that has been poo-pooed for years and years and years by national government is this question about a rental subsidy. Not a capital subsidy, but a rental subsidy to be given to people possibly on a monthly basis or some kind of institutions on a monthly basis to subsidize rental. And with that, to improve people's access to the city, to ensure that they're able to access some of the social goods, rather than to locate people with ownership on the periphery. And so what we can see in this long story that I've told you, okay, it's a very long story, is that a couple of things are going on. The one is the housing and human settlements policy is at the mercy of all of these different forces, political, historical, all kinds of different things. At the same time, what we can also see is that it's a policy that is consistently emerging. It's evolving. It's responsive. It looks at what's going on and tries to find ways of changing and to respond to it. We can also see that no matter what we think, that the idea of the RDP or the BNG starter home, this idea of giving away homes, is not going anywhere. To my mind, it's got too much political capital for it to go anywhere, whether we think it's a good idea or a bad idea. But it's still going to be there in one form or another. And what we're also starting to see are finally some interconnections between planning and housing and planning and human settlements for the first time. Whether they succeed, we don't know. It's too early to tell. But at least they're there. Okay? And what we're also starting to see is that there's some very crazy ideas out there around mega projects, which we really need to rethink. So this is a highly changed and highly dynamic environment. Lots is going on. Okay? But I'll tell you one thing. It's never boring. Okay. I'll end there.